Okay, Doug, list all the hemp products you currently have in your house.
Let's see. I'm most proud of Hemp in Hemp, which is a farm stable product, certified organic that I and my family have grown ourselves to date in Vermont. That's changing in coming years, but we also have, hemp seed oil, hemp hearts, hemp protein meal. We have more specific CBD products as opposed to hemp and hemp, which is broad spectrum. So quite a lot.
You are listening to the Tractor Time Podcast. We are proud to be sponsored by BCS America. BCS two-wheel tractors are real farming equipment for real farmers and homesteaders. BCS is often mistaken for just a rototiller, but with gear-driven transmissions and dozens of professional quality implements, they truly make superior pieces of farming equipment. Engineered and built in Italy, where small farms are a way of life, BCS two-wheel tractors are built to standards of quality and durability expected of real agricultural equipment. The kind of dependability every farm needs. With PTO-driven attachments like rototillers, flail mowers, rotary plows, power harrows, chippers, shredders, snow throwers, even a utility trailer and a high-pressure irrigation pump, BCS America can supply tools you need to get jobs done across the farm and the homestead. Even on large farms where a four-wheel tractor is a necessity, BCS two-wheel tractors can tackle jobs that simply can't be done with the larger machines, from mowing steep slopes and along pond banks to working soil in high tunnels and hoop houses. Check out bcsamerica.com to see the full lineup of tractors and attachments, and watch videos of BCS in action.
We are in a revolution, but it is a revolution in which the side that fires the first shot loses. We will not fire any shots because our weapon is uncommon good sense.
Hello, and welcome to the Tractor Time Podcast, brought to you by Acres USA, the voice of eco-agriculture. I'm your host, Ben Trollinger, and as always, I want to say thank you to our sponsors, BCS America. In this episode, we're talking with Doug Fine. How do you describe Doug? Well, we should probably start with his work as an investigative journalist. His writings appeared in places like The Washington Post, Wired, and Outside Magazine. He's traveled all over the world, including places like Burma, Rwanda, Guatemala, and Tajikistan. He's given TED Talks, he's appeared on late-night talk shows where he talked cannabis with Conan O'Brien, and he's written several books, including Not Really an Alaskan Mountain Man, Farewell My Subaru, which is about his attempt to wean himself off of petroleum, and Too High to Fail, Cannabis and the New Green Economic Revolution. His latest book is Hempbound, and the subtitle says it all, Dispatches from the Frontlines of the Next Agricultural Revolution. And for Doug, those front lines are found at the Funky Butte Ranch. That's his 40-acre spread in southern New Mexico, where he and his family grow hemp, tend a garden, and raise a herd of mischievous goats. And although Doug sees himself as a journalist first, he doesn't shy away from speaking up for what he believes in. And what he believes in is this. Hemp represents not just the next big money maker in agriculture. It's not just about cashing in on CBD oil. Instead, he thinks it's an opportunity to change the entire game and maybe fight off the effects of climate change in the process. Doug's a renegade thinker, he's funny, he talks fast, so strap in for this episode of Tractor Time. Well, thanks so much for joining me. Hemp's played this really fascinating role in early American history, and I think that might be a good place to start. Tell us a little bit about the rise and fall of hemp in the U.S.
Since the age of exploration from a European perspective, hemp was extremely valuable. Every place that Europeans went, they immediately started cultivating hemp for routine ship repairs and dry dock type stuff, starting in as far as the Americas is concerned, 1521, I believe it was, in Chile. So it was a vital crop. You could pay your taxes with it in colonial times. Thomas Jefferson spoke about its importance. I was lucky enough to harvest the first hemp crop in 200 years at George Washington's Mount Vernon last year. A wonderful administrator there, the lands fellow for half a century, is this great guy named Dean Norton, and he invited me to take part in the harvest in colonial clothing with sickles, and I cut my finger on the sickle, so I gave some nitrogen to Mount Vernon, and that was an important crop right from colonial era. The next century was very interesting. There's a lot of towns named Hempfield, Hempstead, that kind of thing all over. Pennsylvania, Long Island, New York, Midwest. But the next century was interesting because the U.S. had to play catch up for quality of cultivars, and so there was industrial, to be polite, borrowing that went on from places like China and Russia, partly funded explicitly through the government, through almost like X Prize type contests. And the U.S. Genetics became the best in the world. Kentucky for a long time was a leader. Hemp was in decline prior to cannabis prohibition, U.S. hemp, but it was poised for a comeback. It wasn't in a massive decline. It just was not at its peak for a variety of reasons as the 30s were underway, 1930s. But it was poised for a comeback. Cannabis prohibition started for a lot of reasons, but principally because Harry Anslinger, who had run alcohol prohibition, needed to keep himself and a lot of people employed, and they needed to find a new enemy because alcohol wasn't the enemy anymore. So cannabis prohibition started with the help of some yellow journalism. And the next year, Popular Mechanics ran a story saying, 25,000 uses for hemp. Hemp was really poised for a comeback. And it did have a fast comeback in World War II when Japan captured the overseas sources of hemp that were being used for millions of tons of rigging needed for naval ships, but also things like the cord in the parachute that saved George H.W. Bush's life when he had to bail out in World War II. So there was a Hemp for Victory campaign to get farmers cultivating again, but then the same prohibition people needed their jobs after the war. So we kind of folded it into the worst policy in America since segregation, which was the war on cannabis, that thankfully, for everything from economy to soil to heartland to planet to climate change mitigation to routine aches and pains for people who want to get off a lot of other pharmaceuticals, thankfully came to an end federally, first in 2014 with a first farm bill provision that allowed the cultivation of hemp for research purposes, which was de facto legalization, and then in late 2018, a new farm bill provision, which is where we are now, with commercial hemp cultivation once again legalized. The industry is growing hugely. It's more than doubling every year. By this 2019 season, we're expected to be at something like, I believe it's 150,000 acres in the U.S. cultivated this year, which is huge considering that it was a Schedule I felony federal crime 5 years ago. Now, among the 7 acres that I have in the ground in 4 states this year, one of them is certified organic, which is a federal designation too. So we've come a long way, baby, but we got a long way to go because there's 237 million acres of corn, soy, wheat, and cotton, with a lot of herbicides and other things going into the ground. So we've got a long way to go with hemp, but the industry is the fastest agricultural industry ever to reach $1 billion in annual value, and we're just getting started.
Before Hempbound, your last book was Too High to Fail, Cannabis and the New Green Economic Revolution. For our listeners, parse out the history of cannabis as a drug and cannabis as an agricultural product with many uses. People still seem to be confused about the distinctions.
The end game is cannabis being considered, as it always has been for all of history until 1976, as one plant. When people were cultivating the cannabis plant for textiles in medieval France, for instance, and when people were cultivating textiles for rope in Kentucky in the 1880s, there was no distinction between hemp and cannabis because THC had not been isolated yet. It was grown for whatever purpose it was needed. Some people used it for textiles and rigging. Some people, and that would be the fiber side of the plant. Some people ate it for its nutritive superfood properties, perfect omega-9, 6 balance, and high in in a lot of minerals that it's hard, especially for people who don't eat meat, to get. And some people smoked it or ingested the flower for everything from health maintenance to spiritual purposes. So that's always, I think I call it the Garden of Eden plant. It was what anthropologists call a camp follower. It was something that before sedentary agriculture, when humans were semi-nomadic, we still planted crops, but only a few important seeds would fit into our pouches as we went from, let's say, a summer seasonal location to. Winter, seasonal, and hemp was one of them. So we've always cultivated it for everything. Michael Pollan believes that we've co-evolved with the plant. And only in 1976 did some researchers, in their words, arbitrarily decide that this certain level of THC, the psychoactive component of hemp, would have a threshold of 0.3% by dry weight, above which would be considered this special new thing, cannabis or, psychoactive cannabis or some, we're moving away from marijuana as a word, which we should. And under 0.3 was this new thing, hemp. And we're, as we should be, moving back to how it's always been for the last 8,000 years, which is it's all one thing, because there's this, the architecture of the plant has 4 components that are all immensely useful for a diverse range of applications. There's the flower, the fiber, the seed, and the root. Root used for building soil and phytoremediation, it's called, and very important in the world's soils that are very stressed due to climate change, or due to monoculture, and also mitigating climate change through sequestering carbon from good agricultural practices through hemp's roots and other phytoremediative crops. Seed, as we said, was superfood. Flower is the hot market right now on all sides of the plant. Dispensaries where all cannabis has been legalized, and also for medicinal cannabis, emphasizing THC in combination with other cannabinoids. And hemp, currently the sort of hot market, the gold rush, is CBD. But THC and CBD are 2 of 111 known cannabinoids, many of which will be shown and are being shown to have value for a range of purposes. And also, we're in our infancy of understanding the entourage effect, which is how the interplay of some of these cannabinoids and other components of the plants called terpenes work in our bodies. So the flower is very much in play. And then there's fiber, which is going to be huge as we move past petroleum and petrochemical products in all of our economy. So very briefly on the fiber, there's 2 sides of the stalk. There's the strip, the bast fiber, the long strip of very strong fiber on the outside that is traditionally used in everything from textiles and paper, and now looks like has applications. One of my favorite things is next generation supercapacitors, and the batteries that are going to be powering our electric cars that are going to be charged by the sun. Our batteries are going to have components made out of hemp. And then there's the hurd, which is the inner core that's left on the fiber when the bast is stripped off. And that's a very hot market right now for everything from building carbon neutral, carbon negative housing, hempcrete is a general term, to microbial balanced animal bedding. But there's a lot of flood and spill cleanup and control. There's a lot of uses for the hurd, which is sort of the low hanging fruit on the fiber. Fiber requires a lot of acreage to be viable. And so we have all these components of the plant now, and they're all cannabis. And the only time where anybody should be thinking about it and worrying about it at all is if a final flower product, because all the cannabinoids, CBD, THC, all of them reside in the flower primarily. There's no CBD in the fiber, none in the seed. It's going to market above a certain, ideally locally designated threshold of THC. It'll be regulated for adult use or medicinal use, below which it should make no difference at all. And this is very important because we should not be putting this 0.3 burden on the farmer. A lot of crops in these early days are having to be destroyed because of this ridiculous arbitrary 0.3. If you're growing for seed or fiber, it shouldn't matter if you have 20% THC in your flower. If you're not marketing that flower, there's no THC in your final product. It should make no difference. So in the end, hashtag one plant. It's cannabis and hemp is the same plant. And for many of us, that's the end game, returning it to how it's always been.
Well, as a former newspaper editor in Colorado who got to witness firsthand legalization of cannabis in our state, I know that using that term, cannabis, as opposed to marijuana, is important for a lot of people. Can you explain for our listeners why marijuana is sort of this fraught and complicated word that probably should go by the wayside?
Well, its use really coincides with the 75 years of cannabis prohibition. It was conjured up to evoke this sort of immigrant frenzy of, oh, these are the before federal prohibition. The model of demonizing the plant was established in states like Arizona and California, and it was modified in the national media to create fear of African American jazz musicians corrupting women, but it started as Mexican laborers. The false stereotype of Mexican laborers corrupting people, and so that's where the term came from. And so it's a pejorative term. The cannabis plant, make no mistake, is an extremely positive plant for humanity. Always has been. It's hugely important for the economy, all sides of the plant. You referenced Colorado's legalization in 2012. Then Governor Hickenlooper of Colorado opposed it. He has his business background is in alcohol. He opposed the legalization, and now he's sort of been on this mea culpa tour, saying it looks like it's going to work. It's awesome. We have the lowest unemployment rate in the nation. It's bringing in $100 million in tax funds in the nation. So any negative connotation for cannabis is on the wrong side of history. It's an extremely positive thing. We should think of it as almost as a family value and a patriotic plant, as we have throughout history, as the founding fathers did. Of course, no one should be using the very small part of the cannabis plant that is potentially psychoactive unless they are an adult or have a medical need. But that's almost irrelevant. Yes, anything can be abused. Yes, we need to have laws to make sure that over certain amounts of THC, if they're going at retail level to the public, that they're regulated. But that's already in process. For the most part, hemp cannabis is just another plant that should be grown widely with minimal regulation. And that's the steps that we're taking. What has happened with the Farm Bill provision last December is saying this is not a plant any longer under the purview of the Justice Department. This has nothing to do with drugs or crime. This is under the purview of the Agriculture Department. This is a plant, and that's the right direction.
Your passion for the subject really comes through in the book, and I'm curious, how did you become a hemp advocate, or do you see yourself that way?
Primarily, I'm a journalist, but everything, all politics, everything is personal, and there were a couple of things that happened that got me involved. The reason why I went to research my previous full cannabis book called Too High to Fail, which is about regenerative cannabis farmers in California's Emerald Triangle, it was because I live in a very, very remote part of New Mexico. Nobody comes where I live by accident. And everybody was minding their business as usual when suddenly one morning my family was put into danger by hundreds of automatic weapons and people wielding them, ready to shoot them. Came into my very remote valley. And who were they? I was paying for them. They were taxpayer funded, interagency border narcotics control force of some kind, going after my retired, clean record neighbor who was self-treating for PTSD and now is a perfectly legal cultivator in New Mexico. Wasted all this money, put everybody in danger, took the guy to jail. His lawyer was waiting. He didn't spend a minute in jail as he deserved not to. He had the right, ethnic background and bank account to not have to really suffer the worst part of being a victim of America's worst policy since segregation, that is the war on cannabis. So he came home, dealt with it, paid his whatever it costs to get out of these kind of things, $12,000. And I just said, this is ridiculous. We've got real problems. At that point in 2010, 2011, when that happened, there was a true war. There still is, but a true war just a few miles south of where I live in Mexico, because I'm in southern New Mexico. In southern New Mexico is where I live. There were thousands of people being killed every day. More than a few people were being killed. That's a war, and the war was because of cannabis and other drug prohibition. And yet we were spending our taxpayer dollars to arrest this peaceful, self-medicating veteran. It was PTSD from his wartime service. That my neighbor was treating. So that's the first thing that made me get involved. And the second was climate change mitigation. Struck home in 2011 in my backyard. Everybody at this point has had some kind of event like this, no matter where they live on the planet. We had a 130,000 acre wildfire that stopped just short of our ranch, but it scared a crazed refugee fledgling black bear into our property in front of my family's eyes, killed most of our goats, put us all in danger, freaked us all out. It affects our lives every day still. We have to be really, really careful. I lived for years in rural Alaska, never worried about predators. But now I have to keep a very close eye out on my human children as well as my goat kids all the time because of this, what they would have one day recently called a millennial event, but which is now just part of stressed ecosystems. So I did some research, and pretty much as an individual, the best thing you or I can do to help stabilize climate is to plant hemp and other regenerative crops. So I'm not just a hair club president. I'm also, a member. So I report on it still, books, short form journalism, television, and then I'm actually planting it, developing a product, developing cultivars, and living it and breathing it.
Well, tell us a little bit about your operation. 40 acres, correct?
Yeah, although we don't cultivate that nearly that much hemp here. This is the first year that New Mexico legalized, and most of my projects, whether I'm a consultant or a university researcher or for my entrepreneurial projects or seed development, are in other states and are still in other states. I'm excited to scale up more here, in the home front, just to help build regional economy. But this first year, I just couldn't not plant, having worked so hard for legalization nationally, but also in my state. And my state's done a great job. Our Department of Agriculture here in New Mexico, you can tell by how many people sign up for the first year of a program. And we have over 300 people in New Mexico paying $700 to $1,000, depending on, there's a range based on acreage and number of cultivars that you grow, to cultivate hemp. So it's not like I'm just doing it for fun, but it's fun. I'm just out there with my family, growing a cultivar that I'm working on. We're doing some breeding to try to enhance certain properties in it. We grow dioecious, which is male and female. It's how everyone has cultivated hemp for 8,000 years until 50 years ago, when sensimilla, or seedless female only crops, were developed. That's because people have been trying to emphasize one cannabinoid, first THC, and then now there's a CBD craze. So whereas 0 people grew non-psychoactive hemp for sensimilla style, say 15 years ago, 80 to 90% of everywhere in the US now, permit holders grow sensimilla just for flower, just to get CBD. That's a gold rush. That's going to go away. I'm sidestepping that. I'm growing male and female plants, my theory being everyone's happier when they're dating. And besides the fact that it gives a seed product, which is, an omega superfood and all that good stuff, it also still produces flower in different cannabinoid ratios than sensimilla does. So it's just a way of sidestepping the herd and the gold rush and trying to create something that is durable and different, and I think a little bit better.
Well, since you've been doing this work yourself, how easy is it to grow hemp, harvest it, process it? As you detail in the book, there is a learning curve, but where does a farmer start if they're curious about learning how to grow hemp?
Cultivation is very easy in some ways and very difficult in other ways. The main thing is, like anything, if you're going to try and leap into it, especially professionally, it has to be your calling. You can't, I'm sure as a journalist, you can't just be like, sounds like fun. Maybe I'll be a journalist and I'll see what that. You have to really want to do that. It's not easy to succeed as a journalist. You have to be passionate and driven, and that's true for anything you do in life, and possibly maybe even a notch more true for anything that derives from a farm, because you can't just plant seeds and walk away. You have to be there paying attention to your field every day. And this is a farmer-based economy, at least for the best products, the kind of products that I would want to have in my family's life. And so the one thing for people who are on the consumer side that I like to say is, really know your farmer, really ask those questions. You should not be walking into Walgreens and buying random CBD. Eventually, of course, inevitably, there's going to be, mixed CBD out there. There's going to be the hemp sandwich or whatever at the fast food joint. But you actually are really, really wise, as with anything you put into your body, to be paying attention to regional and fair trade values, but also things like organic certification and mode of planting. This is a matter of opinion, and hemp is a very big tent. But for me, outdoor cultivation is a basic baseline. We are given incredibly complex soil and amazing sunlight, and that's what agriculture is. And it doesn't mean I don't think anything should ever be grown in a grow room or in a greenhouse. There are reasons for it, times of year for it. But what I look for in any kind of hemp cannabis product is outdoor organic cultivation and the farmer being the entrepreneur. So somebody that is marketing a CBD product who buys fungible CBD isolate from grown in who knows where, anywhere from around the corner to Ukraine to China, that's not a product I'm looking for. I want to see organic certification. I want to see that I'm supporting a farmer in my community. So these are the most important values. Therefore, to get back to your question of if you're getting started on the production end, it's very hard because you have to grow it, which isn't that hard, especially if you've got a green thumb and do your research. But you've got to be there every day paying attention to it. And then you and or someone in your family or organization has to be busting their tail about marketing and packaging and delivery and really getting out there to educate people. Because most people, believe it or not, we who are familiar with hemp, we think everybody in the world must know about it. Everybody must be eating it. Everybody must know about CBD and the other cannabinoids. But in truth, 99% of American homes have zero hemp products in them. So education is a key part of every product. So it's much harder than farming has been in the past because you can't just grow a good product. You then have to, or concurrently, have to be getting it out to the world. So there's no time off.
Well, so let's talk a little bit about farming hemp organically. How well suited is it to that practice, farming without pesticides and herbicides?
Well, that part of it is no problem. The issue is every ecosystem is going to be different. And a lot depends on what your final application is growing for. Because if it's your business, you're growing for a specific application. So if you're marketing chocolate covered hemp hearts, let's say, you want to be maximizing seed production. That's a very different style of cultivation than if you're specifically growing flower for a combination of cannabinoids or just CBD, or some people even just market certain terpenes, which are other components of the flower. So a lot depends on where you're growing, and a lot depends on how you're growing, what you're growing for, and a lot depends on how much you're growing. For instance, at 10 acres or under, or certainly under 5 or under, if you have enough reliable people on hand, can conceivably, functionally, and effectively hand plant and hand harvest a crop that actually can make a family or 3 a living. That's really unheard of in most agriculture for the last 100 years, that people have been going the other direction, scaling up into huge acreage. That said, if your plan is to wholesale organic hemp seed or to start a fiber cooperative so you can start making hempcrete or animal bedding, which is a really hot market, for that to be viable, you have to be growing on huge acreage, which requires a lot of farm equipment, not necessarily more work. So it really depends on what you're growing for. The hardest to grow for is flower. That's like prima donna stuff. Any psychoactive cannabis farmer can tell you. They're watching their crop every second and really tending those flowers because there's so much value in the flower. Whereas if you're growing 500 acres for seed, it's still hard work, but you're not worrying about manicuring every plant. And when it comes to organic, that's really about soil preparation. And we're all, no matter what crop we're in, we're all soil farmers now. It's about prepping your crop, and it's about thinking about the microorganisms that are under the soil. You think about that for months, ideally years, but at least like the winter before you're even thinking about planting in the spring. Be doing all the research that you can on what it takes to effectively build soil in an organic way. There are a lot of good ways of enhancing what we call these effective microorganisms, the good fungi and bacteria and other elements, nematode layer in your soil. I still consider myself a novice at that side of it. But to give you one example, I and my family did go up into our hills to collect mycelium, because if you embed and sort of seed your soil with the fungus from its own ecosystem, it tends not only to take better, but to last more. So you're having to do less soil amending in coming seasons. So number one thing I'd say is focus for months before you even think about planting on building soil. If you've taken care of that step, the next step is making sure you're getting good and reliable genetics. Almost everybody who's coming into it fresh has some kind of issue with their initial genetics, or the people who provided it. They get ripped off with genetics that aren't what they expected, or they get overcharged, or they don't plant it the right way or the right time. So unlike some of the more experienced farmers of other crops who go into hemp and can't believe all these quote greenhorns that go into hemp, I'm on a different way of thinking. While I do think it's vital to have a business game plan and to prep soil, I encourage anybody who wants to do it and who is willing to work at it hard for a couple of years before they see positive revenue, I would recommend go ahead and do it, because we're at 1% of Americans making their living from farming today. It was 30% when cannabis prohibition started, and 90% in Thomas Jefferson and George Washington's day when they were planting. So we absolutely need more people making their living from the soil, building soil, and mitigating climate change.
Soil health is an obsession with our listeners. That's really what we focus a lot of our podcasts on. And I'm really curious to hear more about how hemp interacts with the soil. In the book, for example, you talk about its application in cleaning up the Chernobyl disaster.
Yes. So hemp is not itself a, let's say, a nitrogen fixer. In fact, as with most crops, it's wise to plant hemp in rotations. That said, there are fields in France and China that have been continually planted since the Middle Ages because people know how to rotate crops and build crops and use bridge crops and all that kind of stuff. But the really interesting soil building, a phytoremediative component of hemp is its taproots. For an annual plant, it has unusually strong taproots. And what that does is really, it's an architectural thing. It's a manual thing. Hemp creates that aeration, that underground ecosystem that allows nitrogen building and other nutrient building crops to have the ideal neighborhood in which to thrive. So it works well in concert with other crops. So our overwinter crop before we planted our first crop here in New Mexico this year was kind of a vetch combination, a nitrogen building crop. And then the only thing we added to our soil was we're lucky we feed our goats organically. So I've got tons of alfalfa mixed with goat poop. You couldn't ask for anything better to toss on your soil. And then as I mentioned, we added the local mycelium, do some trace mineral through kelp on there, certified organic kelp. But other than that, we're letting the soil do its own thing. And I'm liking our first crop here in New Mexico, but I anticipate even better crops in future now that hemp is starting to do its thing, which is chunk those holes in the soil and allow that underground forest that is so vital to thrive.
Break down the many uses of hemp. In reading the book, it seems like there's just endless promise there. CBD oil soaks up a lot of the attention, but there's a lot more to the story.
Sure, I'll give you my favorite in each of the 4 parts of the plant. We already talked about roots. Phytoremediation and healing soil is the number one thing. It's going to help mitigate climate change, clean up soil that's not just toxified from like Superfundy stuff and nuclear disasters, but from really the worst damage to the soil, acreage wise, by the tens of millions of acres is a century of bad monoculture. And so that's the root. You mentioned CBD, so I'll go next to flower. Hemp is a daily part of my family, my human and my non-human family's diet. It's just healthy food. The flower side, the cannabinoids, one of the most important pieces of advice that I could give to anybody entering hemp, especially if they're thinking about an edible product or a flower product, is to not make any claims. That's just putting yourself at risk, even though it's true. Many of us, you come out with a product, you hope for the best, and all of a sudden people are telling you that you've changed their lives in a positive way, and it's a wonderful feeling and all that, but I don't put it on my labels because you don't want to make claims. But just speaking personally and anecdotally, components in the hemp flower, and I don't think it's about milligrams of CBD per unit. I think it's about that entourage effect we were talking about. Personally, I believe it's about, everybody's body's different, but it's about ratios of different cannabinoids, terpenes, bioflavonoids within that flower. And then that can be really beneficial to people. And I'm not even talking about medicinally, when you're really talking about acutely fighting things, certain types of, documented certain types of cannabinoids have been documented to be effective in combating horrible forms of childhood epilepsy or being cytotoxic, that is tumor reversing in certain types of cancer. Research is early and all that. Aside from that, I'm just talking about health maintenance for people blessed with good health. The flower side's wonderful. Moving to seed, that's the real superfood. You can today get any kind of seed product, hemp hearts, hemp seed oil, hemp protein meal in any good supermarket. I urge people, it's vital to seek out organic certified hemp, unless you're growing, you're buying it at a farmer's market from your neighbor who isn't certified organic, but is not dumping glyphosate or other toxins on it, because most non-organic hemp that's marketed commercially does have that kind of stuff applied. So you really want to be thinking about organic, but it's a superfood. I eat it in every form almost every day. Hemp seed oil, hemp hearts, hemp protein. as do our non-humans. So that's and commercially we're moving towards animal feed, recognizing that hemp is excellent. There's already studies that confirm that, but believe it or not, we have human certification is generally regarded as safe before we have it in livestock, although it is legal to feed to your own livestock, not to your commercial livestock that others may eat. You can, for instance, feed it legally to, let's say, your dogs and horses, but not to cattle or pigs or chickens that you whose meat and eggs or meat you might sell. And that's going to change. In fact, I have an email in my inbox today from the working group that's involved in the animal feed effort. So that'll be taken care of soon. So now we've talked flower, roots, and seed. My favorite application from the fiber, I'll give you one from each side of the fiber. From that inner core, that hurd, I love the construction dynamic. Really, we contribute a huge amount to climate change and carbon use and fossil fuel use through our construction industry. And hemp-based building with the core of the herd it's magnificent. It's a really effective building, and it's in its infancy and has a lot of growing pains to go through in terms of getting certified by building agencies and other elements to it. It's not necessarily as plug and play as today's kind of stick drywall building is, but it's superior when done right. And it's going to be different per climate. Like where I live in the Southwest, there's going to be much more adobe style hemp versus more similar to sort of wood building in a Pacific Northwest type environment. And then last, and my favorite hemp application is the research that's going into, from the bast fiber, the next generation battery components. Long story short, because there's a lot to this, ideally we want to be moving away from rare earth stuff and from other non-regenerative components of our digital age lifestyle, but we'd like to keep those components. So biomaterials such as hemp are an important part of it. And hemp itself, just one of the nice evolutionary traits that the hemp fiber at the nano level is showing, is actually the most effective next generation supercapacitor material yet discovered. It outperforms everything else, often much more toxic materials, when it comes to the rapidity with which you can charge your batteries. That's what we're talking about as of now with hemp. We're not talking about holding a charge longer necessarily, that part of your battery. We're talking about the supercapacitor part, which is getting the batteries that are powering our solar powered cars and homes and factories and everything charged more quickly. And that's where hemp is showing a lot of promise. And that's probably my favorite fiber application.
You also mentioned in the book, hemp is a renewable energy source.
Yes. So in Hemp Bound, so I'm working on this and almost finished with the next book, working title Hemp Found. In Hemp Bound, I was really excited. I still am. An anaerobic combustion mode for energy that's being used in Europe, called gasification, and it's cool because it emits very little carbon, but it still is combustion, and it is, because hemp is so quickly renewable, because you can be regrowing it annually, it can provide a lot of energy to innovative grids systems under sort of today's way of doing things. But after Hemp Bound came out is when this research was revealed about the supercapacitor stuff. And I'd like to see us move beyond combustion overall and rather just be having batteries that themselves are regenerative, being charged from the sun and charging our devices rather than having to burn anything.
In your book, you introduce us to some of the modern pioneers of hemp production in the U.S. and also, people who own companies like Dr. Bronner's Soap, who are really sort of creating markets and fighting the good fight. In particular, it's fascinating how David Bronner fought the government and won. You could tell that story, or if there are other people who are sort of blazing a path here that you want to feature, you're welcome to do that too.
Well, I'll tell you, anybody who gets into hemp today is still a pioneer. We're at these 150,000 acres in 2019. That's nothing compared to the millions of acres, 89 point something for corn alone. So you're my hero if you get into regenerative organic hemp cultivation today. Cultivate outdoors and think about regenerative techniques, from everything from how you farm to how you distribute. then you're my hero. But as far as people that are already in the industry, and we all have our rock stars, and it's people doing the battery research. You mentioned Dr. Bronner's. Yeah, I mean, I use that soap every day, and they're also explicitly as a company using the lessons of the plants to run a righteous company where there's only whatever amount of times higher that the CEO makes than the lowest paid employee, and good profit sharing and all that business. So it's not just how you cultivate, it's how you run your business. And then you have a great product like people like Dr. Bronner's and Nutiva do. Since writing Hempbound and since the industry has really taken off, I would say that my real heroes are the people that are proving that small acreage entrepreneurial hemp can actually be viable. I'm very proud of my product, and as everybody should be, my own product is my favorite product. That's how it should. Ed Rosenthal, the famous cannabis grower, always says, what's the best herb you've ever had? Your own. And it's true. But if I'm somewhere else and I dropped a bottle of my own and I need to find hemp, I am seeking out someone in that. Let's say I'm in South Carolina. I'm seeking out hemp from a company, let's say, called Palmetto Harmony, where a mother who had to get into hemp, had no cannabis hemp experience, but her daughter, severe epilepsy, traditional modes, or what we call traditional modes, weren't helping, found that hemp helped, couldn't get a supply, started a company, and just does it right. Certified organic, complete vertical, everything is in a product they grow. Those are my heroes, the people that do it like that. And there's more and more. And I advise everyone, I hope everyone will, first and foremost, look for those kind of products in their own community and in their own region. And then, secondly, if you get really into it, then kind of treat it the way that wine connoisseurs or cheese connoisseurs do, which is look for the specialty products and the specialty shops where there's a terpene cannabinoid combination that you're not used to, or a solar powered farming operation. All of these things exist, by the way, so that you're always supporting something that's independent farmer and top shelf organic product.
Doug, what's the current legal situation for hemp?
Well, we're having this conversation in August of 2019. And my hope is that if people are listening to this, let's say by 2021, maybe sooner, that everything that we're about to say is going to be dated, because all cannabis will be completely legal. The federal government and federal regulations will be out of the cannabis game, and it will be up to states and localities to regulate all cannabis, regardless of its THC level. So what we today call cannabis, what we today call hemp, that will be 100% in the state's hands to decide. And, there may be a few exceptions, like cannabis over a certain THC level, if it's engaged in interstate commerce, might have something to do with federal oversight. But even today, hemp is 100% commercially legal. As of last December, when the second Farm Bill provision passed, there's no more research provision. It's commercially legal. What's happening now is what we all have to keep an eye on, especially as independent entrepreneurs and independent farmers, is that the USDA and the FDA, which made clear that they're the new sheriffs in town with the freeing up of folks like the DEA to work on pharmaceutical, crimes and opioid addiction and all that business. Since we've started from this conversation, many people have died of alcohol-related causes, opiate-related causes. Nobody's ever died from cannabis. So it's a good thing that cannabis is out of, almost totally out of the federal purview, which is humanly, but it is totally out of the federal purview if it's got 0.3% of THC or less at the final product. So we've got the USDA and the FDA say that they're going to start issuing their regulations in time for the 2020 planting season. And we got to keep a very close eye on that, because when you look at the lobby groups and the people that are trying to influence this policy, unsurprisingly, it's a lot of folks that are trying to play the same game as agriculture's been going for the last century. And we're saying this time the farmers are in charge. So if there are regulations that don't work for independent producers, in other words, if it's a model of regulation from our federal agencies that forces the kind of ultra pasteurization and sort of homogenization that we see in so many of our other food products, we're not playing that game. We're selling a living product, those of us who want to, and we are the heart and the largest component, we independent farmers, of the young hemp industry. And our challenge is to organize in such a way that our voices are heard, and that if we don't like the initial regulations that we're seeing, if they favor big ag, if if they favor anonymity, for instance, and where in sourcing of hemp, where it could come from anywhere, be produced anywhere with what kind of pesticides are, we say no way. We're not playing that game. The farmers are in charge, and we're going to make the regulations the way that we want them. And here's something that I hope folks will keep in mind. Because hug a prohibitionist, because we've had 75 years, really 81 years of our plant being off the above ground market, we're not tied to any ball and chain of the way agriculture has been done before. So when you hear people say, oh, well, you can't do that for hemp because that's not all such and such corn and cotton and wheat and this is, the answer is, well, how's that working out for the corn farmers? Why is there farm aid? There's farm aid because it's not working out for the farmers. We're doing it differently, and we're starting from scratch. We don't have any attachment to any way that agriculture has been done for the last 81 years. Here's how we're doing it, and you're doing it our way, or we're going to get you replaced. And the great news is quite a lot of our politicians are on our side. The tipping point has been reached, and quite a lot of our regulators, being agriculture departments, they're farmers. So they have innate sympathy towards farmers, and they know that farmers are struggling, and they know that monoculture doesn't work. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we are going to see small acreage farmer-friendly regulations evolve. I don't think we necessarily are going to love the first set of regs that come out in time for the 2020 season by USDA or FDA, but if we don't, we'll change them.
Let's talk numbers for a minute. What does hemp sell for? What's the worldwide market in terms of dollars, and how big could it get?
It's going to get huge. The issue is, are the farmers going to make the money? So starting with the current gold rush, CBD is a gold rush. And in any gold rush, the prospectors don't make the money. The middlemen, the shovel makers make the money. And there's bursts of exuberance, and then there's correction, as they call it. And so the prices that are, let's say, wholesale flower prices for CBD cultivars right now, they're short-lived. They're high, almost psychoactive cannabis high. You could get between $200 and $1,500 a pound for your flower, and you could harvest potentially 1,000 pounds per acre. Meaning, if you do the math, 1,000 times 200, like that's theoretically a very, very good crop on just a few acres. But that's not how it's good. If you're putting your eggs in that basket, you're going to go bankrupt in a couple of years, in my view, because gold rushes don't last. So there's always going to be CBD grown, but as the crop products, the mass products become fungible, independent farmers aren't going to be able to churn out and find markets for their wholesale. Their wise move is to have a slow, steady growth plan, market a product that's different in some way than what anybody else is doing, and then you have a long-term capacity to make a good, lucrative living. I like to talk about Kevin Hart, the comedian, noticing when he made it that in his neighborhood it wasn't actors and comedians, it was dentists and lawyers, right? He's like, oh, my kids, I want them to be dentists and lawyers. That's how you get in the good neighborhood. I want that to be farmers, a really strong, solid, mid-six-figure or more living for growing a good product. It's not a gold rush. You got to work hard every year, but you're making a really good living as an independent farmer. That's my goal. And so that was just the flower side. Growing organic for seed right now, if you sell this is more appropriate for folks that maybe are growing sections, what they call thousands of acres in the heartland, let's say, or North Dakota, Minnesota farmer growing 3,000 acres. It's not that much harder to grow 3,000 acres of hemp for seed than it is to grow 100 acres for seed. And if you grow 3,000 acres and you grow it organically, there's probably a long-term stable market. I hope I'm right about this, at roughly the $1 a pound level. Conservatively, the new normal is 1,000 pounds harvested per acre. So at 3,000 acres, that's 3,000 pounds. A ton, right. Sorry, 1,000 pounds per acre. So 3,000 acres times 1,000 is $250,000 gross at $1 a pound wholesale. So even though I don't recommend farmers wholesale, at large acreage, which what we need for the seed and fiber side, there is a long-term potential lucrative market for and not only that, but you're building soil, fighting climate change, for hemp in the seed and fiber side.
Canada and China are the global leaders in hemp production. How did that come to be?
Canada legalized first in 96, and God bless them, they grew the seeds that was pressed into the organic hemp oil that provided the prenatal care of a lot of the prenatal care in my own family for my own sons, and that's great. The Canadians, until I think last year, were focused 90% on seed. They burned the fiber in the field, and the flower side wasn't legal for them to do. So they're scrambling, and I hope they do well. I hope everybody does well. But Canada's early lead was because they focused on seed, and they started in the 90s. I think the genetics are. Michael Pollan calls America's cannabis farmers the best gardeners of his generation. I agree. I think that I'm not trying to be jingoistic here, although I am a patriot. I would say I'm speaking as objectively as journalists can when I say look to America to be the hemp a leader. China has been the leader, especially on the fiber side, because for a lot of reasons, labor costs, not a lot of prohibition angst, not a lot of reefer madness, and they hand harvest a lot, even at large acreage, which leads to better fiber. And so China has a large fiber lead that may or may not continue, but I like to see things as locavore as possible.
The research for this book took you all over the world. Tell us about some of those adventures and what you learned and what surprised you.
Farmers have the same concerns all over the world, and the cannabis hemp reemergence is a worldwide phenomenon. When I speak to farmers who are from Morocco or Belgium or Uruguay, North Dakota, and Alaska, they're saying the same thing, which is we want to be able to make a good living. We want to help build soil and build communities. We're doing it differently this time. Get out of our way regulatory wise. So you're hearing this all over the world. An important lesson that I learned was during research in Belgium. I noticed that there were 2 10-hectare plots catty corner of hemp, different cultivars. You could tell they would look different, kind of different growing patterns, different colors. And I asked the farmer that I was visiting who grew one of those, are you worried about the 2 cultivars cross-pollinating? And she said, no, we're not reinventing agriculture here. This is how farmers always work. I mean, this is nothing different and magical that's been going on. So the lesson that I took away from this is we now have, with cannabis hemp's reemergence, a lot of different ways that people are growing flower for psychoactive, growing flower for non-psychoactive, growing seeded crops for seed, growing seeded crops for fiber, phytoremediation. Bottom line, humans have been cultivating this plant for 8,000 years. They've been growing it Sensimilla style for maybe 40 years, and they've been growing hemp for Sensimilla style for maybe 10 years. No one mode has predominance over any other mode. If one mode has predominance, it would be the mode that's been grown for 8,000 years. That's going to be large acreage and save humanity through climate change mitigation. But no, it's all equal. Every farmer has a freedom to farm how he or she wants, where he or she wants, and making sure that that is a successful enterprise for everyone. And I like all sides of the cannabis plant. Making sure that's a successful enterprise for everyone is about good communication and good farming skills. That's primarily what it's about. After every successful revolution, or most in history, you see the winners turning on each other. And that's what we've got to avoid here. Recognize we are all welcome to grow what kind of cannabis hemp we want, wherever we want it, at any time. And we're not reinventing agriculture. The key is communication, cooperation, and good agricultural skills as we evolve into a professional industry.
Well, there's obviously a lot of really positive things happening around hemp production, but what trends or developments within the hemp boom worry you or concern you?
The only one that really worries me is well, there's 2. I'd say non-organic cultivation needs to go away. Everybody must cultivate in a regenerative way, everything, because otherwise we go away as a species. The earth will be fine. The other thing, though, is overregulation is what needs to be avoided. And as we discussed a little bit earlier, that's just about making sure that the small farmer voice is heard. And that's about, I don't know how we're going to do that, because when you get to the national level, it tends to be all about lawyers and lobbyists and not about farmers. And if they're representing farmers, they tend to be represented by big farmers, the kind of people that have a lot of money going in. And so one way or another, we've got to make sure that there is a countercurrent to this. There's a global food certification movement on now that's sort of like the NAFTA of food certification. And there's some positive things about it, namely that you can be sure that, you're not going to, or hopefully not going to have you're going to have a small chance of getting, let's say, a salmonella from your spinach or whatever. But on the other hand, it's regulating people out of existence. And like so much high altitude regulation, it doesn't allow for the kind of product that I and millions of people want, which is living products cultivated by independent farmers. So we've got to make sure that there are entire industry sectors for the craft producers that are allowed up to, let's say, 1 million, I'm just throwing a number out there, 1 million pounds of product per year, you're able to cultivate in this way that doesn't force you into sort of the hemp version of ultra pasteurization. That's something we got to really keep an eye on, is unnecessary over regulation. We all want food to be safe, but we're not all in the robo food game.
What about genetically modified hemp? Is that in development? Is that a concern for you?
It's so far from what I or anybody who thinks remotely like me would ever consider for their own food that it's not personally a concern. Without a doubt, there is some research into it. That I could give a couple of examples, but for the most part, it's very off-brand for hemp. Hemp is already associated with healthy lifestyles, and people who live healthy lifestyles are on to glyphosate. They're on to GMO and monoculture mentalities. And so I hope that it'll never happen on the marketplace. If it for some reason appears and is legal, that it would fail. But bottom line, I want to see commercial hemp associated with organic hemp. And if that's the case, in other words, if today what we consider kind of like alternative organic food becomes the normal, the conventional for hemp, then GMO is off the table to begin with, because you can't have organic products that are GMO.
Here in Colorado, I can go down to the apothecary and get really high-end CBD oil. But I can also go to the gas station, the loaf and jug, and they're selling CBD oil on the counter, a lot cheaper. How can consumers sort of spot what represents quality and sort of the values that you're about, and the stuff that is merely cashing in on a trend?
I think the craft beer market is a good model for this. Overall beer sales are down, but the craft market is in the $20-30 billion range and growing every year, taking up more space because it tastes better and it's better quality and people know it. So that's a mentality that I'd like to see. I mean, you've got one strike let's put it this way. One thing going in your favor if you're shopping at a farmer's market or a food co-op, and one strike against you if you're walking into a corner store for your hemp in the first place, because the way distribution channels generally work for a quickie mart is not the same way that your local food co-op, with which, if it's really a cooperative, it has a mandate. One of the co-op principles is supporting regional enterprises and the regional economy and community. So it becomes much easier to seek out low carbon, mild, and organic food just by choosing the venue where you shop. But that's that example of you're on the road and you dropped your bottle of whatever you like to take for your hemp cannabis each day, and you've got to go into a store and buy it. And you can't find a local food. I mean, we've all got Yelp in our phones, right? Like, find a local food co-op, and that's your best chance. But if you can't, then find a Whole Foods or an organic supermarket, so that something's going to be organic. And if you are really desperate and walk into a corner store, if you can't find a product that is clearly saying on the label that all the hemp is grown organically relatively nearby, I would argue, except in the case of extreme medical need, you're better off not buying it and waiting till you can get to one of those other platforms.
So hemp, it seems to me, my perception is that hemp is sort of a high-end product. It's expensive. Do you see that changing, and should it change?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, Joe, I like to call this the non-poison surcharge, and it's not just hemp. Again, I my hugest expense, I mean, far and away, even though we've got goats and a garden, my hugest expense in my family is food, because we go when we make our rare town trips a couple times a month, we spend a lot of money on good food at our food co-op. We've got posters of us in our food co-op, how much money we spend there. And we're real believers in, pay the grocer now and not the doctor later, right? And there's a lot of factors that go into that. So it's really grace of God kind of thing. But we're trying to do our part, eat well and exercise and have love in your life and think positively. And so we're used to paying more, that non-poison surcharge today. And it's really about consumer demand. When consumers are demanding more of a product, eventually the price will go down. But it's a double-edged sword. You want your food prices to have a certain price point so that farmers are being paid well. Lost in this crazy, stupid anti-immigrant hysteria BS that's going on in our country right now is if there weren't people that were willing to be paid farm working wages, how much higher even the crappy food prices would be. And so the reality is the farm economy is a very, very complex economy. It's not free market. There's so many factors going in between farm labor and subsidies of certain crops and not other crops, and so many factors. But in the end, I would say, I'll speak for my own product. I would like to see my own product as it gradually scales up to gradually scale down in price. But there always are going to be top shelf farm to table. I and my partners and my fellow farmers for my product, we work really hard. We love that crop from soil prep through fast forward 10 months through harvest and this long, extensive decarboxylation process for infusing our product, which is unusual and time consuming. We deserve to make a living from it. And there are other products that are going to be maybe faster to make that are going to be lower priced. So I want to see healthy products of all kinds be accessible to everybody, not just people with income. And if you work hard and at everything and are the best at what you do, you deserve to make a living from it.
Okay, so you're writing a sequel. You're in the middle of writing a sequel to Hemp Bound. What's left to explore?
Well, a huge amount. I feel I'm so eager for this next book to come out because Hemp Bound was written, it came out 2 months after the first 2014 Farm Bill. So essentially on the same exact time that the first federally legal hemp farms were started. It was all researching it was a blueprint. Like this is what Willie Nelson was kind enough to blurb. So he called it a blueprint for the America of the future. I love that. I think about it a lot and feel great about it. So it's a blueprint. It's sort of a high altitude sketch of what will happen based on research and based on what was happening in other parts of the world that were ahead of U.S. legalization. Almost immediately after that book came out, hemp was de facto legalized with that first federal Farm Bill research provision. So I actually quickly did on hemp paper a second follow-up monograph that I still sell off my website called First Legal Harvest, which actually contains some of the hemp from the first farmers who grew legally in the U.S. And talks about what those first farmers were doing. And then I became one of those farmers. And I've spent the last 5 years researching, filming, and being this first wave farmers. And that's what this new book coming out in April 2020, working title Hemp Bound. It might change. It's really the challenges and opportunities for an independent regenerative entrepreneur. How to make it in hemp if your goal is to do it on relatively small acreage, build soil, build community, still make a living. Your end game is not buyout by hedge funds or going public. Your end game is a long-term, multi-generational enterprise that does well by your family and your community. That's what the new book's about.
There you have it. Doug Fine, Bringing the Fire. Go buy his book. It's published by Chelsea Green Publishing. It has a quote from Willie Nelson on the cover, and it's available at the Acres USA bookstore at acresusa.com. Thanks again to our listeners and our sponsor, BCS America. You can find this podcast at ecofarmingdaily.com, acresusa.com, or anywhere podcasts can be played. Thanks, and have a great week.